Hey guys, so today we're going to talk about a founder's agreement. So I've been receiving a lot of questions about how to do a founder's agreement, what goes into it, how to compensate one person or another, and really what are some of the intricacies involved with this kind of task. So what I found was a really good tool to use. It's called startups.com. So I'm going to go ahead and start by referencing there, and then I'll go ahead and share some of the notes I have as talking points that are relative to your project and your position right now with your startup foundation. Alrighty, so let me go ahead and screen share, and then we can start looking at some of these talking points. So the first thing you'll see three tabs, but it's all from the startups.com library. So I highly recommend after this call or after this recording, you look at these as well. And forgive me while I take some water, but in front of you, you can see one of the major reasons why you want to have a founder's agreement in the first place. So I highlighted a section that I thought was very important to start with. So first of all, this article is called How to Create a Founder's Agreement for Your Startup. And then I highly recommend you read this. I'll send you a couple links with additional links for how to reference this. But it's not until you achieve success that money and greed come into play. Entrepreneurs stop thinking about the vision of their companies and begin to think about themselves. When my co-founder, in this case, the author Megdad, and I fell victim to this, Feel Free, the name of their company, changed from a success to a nightmare. And that's one thing we're trying to avoid, the nightmare scenario. So what is a founder's agreement? We've already kind of talked about it in length, but it's how do you create a document, a legally binding document for what, how, and who receives what, who manages what, and how the co-founders will be compensated. I recommend this is something that should be done before really you start making money and whatnot. So what should be included? You can see there are a number of articles here, names of the founder, ownership structure. Now, I thought this is a very important part to discuss because the ownership structure really discusses management interests. More importantly, who is in charge? So regarding this specific project, Hyung should probably be in charge of her company because she's been putting in a lot of the time work and she has that historical evidence and documentation. So it's important that we understand who's the ownership structure because you want to avoid incongruencies or differences in vision. So there should be a clear vision, mission, and purpose. And the person in charge, the founder, should be the one in charge, and they should own that management interest position. So more than 51% of a company, position, etc. You can read some more here what that means. You should also include what the project is, what it involves. For Operation Sensory Book, that's already been outlined on the CONOP or the action plan. For Operation A New Gray, we're going to create that over the next few weeks. So additional things that should be included are the initial capital and additional contributions. This is such an important part of it, and I'll read the entire thing for you. So every founder of your startup contributed something to become a founder. That contribution could be cash, property, services rendered, a promissory note, or some combination of the above, or even a promise of one of the above. So you can see that a founder has to have some sort of contribution in there. When I'm working in the nonprofit management space, each one of my co-founders, or rather my board of directors, they contribute either specific knowledge, time, sweat equity, money, capital, or some sort of equipment, resource, or knowledge base that I don't have and that they could provide. When it comes to A New Gray and Sensory Labs, you both have contributions, specific knowledge, and really critical knowledge that can help each other's projects. So I'd highly recommend considering a co-founder for both projects. You guys would be co-founders or additional contributions, partnerships, collaborators for each other's projects. And then once again, we both discussed doing a third entity if you guys want to have 50-50 management of a new product or service, which would be something like Sensory Gray, just to combine the concepts together. More importantly, there's still going to be some issues in regards to management if you guys have the 50-50 split. Who's in charge? Who makes the decisions? Whatnot? What direction, what vision and motivation and purpose do you guys create? What products do you guys prioritize? So what's important here is how to structure that, and we'll discuss that later on. If one of your co-founders contributes something other than cash, you all need to figure out the monetary value that thing of that thing and recorded here. You also need to figure out whether members will continue to contribute capital throughout the life of the company or just at that initial investment. So important here is that a co-founder typically invests capital, some sort of monetary contribution. If not capital, then something called sweat equity. I've been giving you 8 hours or 40-hour weeks for the last 1 year. I deserve a 10%, 10 to 20% compensation. Now, let me give you an example, just using myself as an example. So when it comes to grassroots peace builders, we've been integral in helping develop the project management plan, the link canvas plan, the marketing plan, all kinds of things for Operation Sensory or for Sensory Lab. But I've never asked for anything. If I was to ask for something, I would not ask for anything more than 10% equity position. Why? Because I haven't contributed money. I've only contributed specific knowledge, and I've helped create the idea and value. And those are all critical, important things. But I know that Hyung and Sensory Labs, you guys are going to need as much equity as possible. That means you're going to need to control as much of your company as possible so that in the future, you can start getting equity to investors. People are going to give you $100,000 for 10% of your company. People are going to give you maybe access to a warehouse, a resource warehouse, where they'll let you use their equipment or maybe give you some products for free. So those are all things that are tangible, monetary, and that you can contribute. And those are things I would recommend exchanging some equity if it's valuable enough. If it's not, then it's a partnership or collaboration. Once again, you have to figure out the monetary value of that thing and record it in this document. Now, specific knowledge is valuable. You both have specific knowledge, and the specific knowledge I bring is important as well. Project management, operations, lean canvas, business planning, marketing, all that stuff is very valuable. But the difference here is that I'd never ask for anything. If I did, I'd ask for no more than 10% because I'm not contributing money. And so that's huge. But if I was a full-time staffer or I was a full-time ops guy, then I could be justified asking for 10%. So remember, 10% has to be quantified in money or sweat equity. Who's working 40 hours a week for your project full-time? Then, okay, give them that. But if it's part-time, then 5%, then less. Now, regarding both of you guys' situations, you guys are going to have to negotiate what that means to you and how much you can invest in terms of time, resources, knowledge, and network. So those are things we'll talk about in a little bit. But keep that in mind. So that is what a fair monetary value exchange looks like. So the expenses and budget is something you list in this founder's document. Taxes, a bit of a thing here with taxes. It says hire a tax professional. I highly agree. I recommend that you do that as well as a legal person. And we'll talk about that in a second. The roles and responsibilities is huge. So this is another one that you might think you have handled with a verbal agreement or even an unspoken understanding of where everyone is good at, but don't fall into this trap. For example, this guy started the company with 4 founders, but nobody had defined roles. As a result, people started doing all kinds of tasks. They did a bunch of tasks without finishing them. And only one person, the 4th person in this case, was able to handle everything else. So he wrote the processes and then eventually got blamed for everything that failed or everything that succeeded. Ultimately, it became the final responsibility of him. But even if we define roles later on, ultimately, the only way they found success, or really the only way they were able to make a profit from this divided vision, mission, and really work breakdown structure was to sell the company. So it failed because there's no clear defined roles at the beginning. More importantly, who's in charge? Who's the CEO? Who's the COO, chief operating officer, the chief technology officer? Who's a medical resident expert? Those are all roles you guys can fill, and you can assign appropriate monetary value and equity position. Equity meaning how much of the company do they own? Because equity ends up being exchanged later on for money or resources, network, and stuff like that. So equity is such a big, important term. Once again, the most important recommendation I can give to any founder is to keep as much of your company as possible. Because one day you may want to share it for someone else who's giving it full time, 60 hours per week maybe, or someone else who is investing $100,000 for 10%, and you need that growth capital. So it's important that you maintain 100%. As much as your company as possible, more than 51%, but keep as much as possible because you're going to need it later on. So rather than letting your startup get to that point, make sure you spell it out in your founder's agreement, who's responsible for what. By writing out each founder's roles and responsibility, you'll not only be making sure that the buck stops with whom it's supposed to stop, but also that you and your co-founders are rehashing each other's work, because that kind of inefficiency will lead to startup failure as well. And something I already saw with the notes from the revisions for the pitch deck was that it went from being very specific and niche to a little bit unclear. So we had to go backwards in order to go forward. So in order to avoid that inefficiency, we got to have that work breakdown structure and that organizational structure as well. So keep that in mind. All right. Importantly is the management and legal decision-making, operating and approval rights. Who's going to do what? Who's going to vote on company decisions? Who isn't? What will they be able to vote on? And you can read the rest of the paragraph. But you can see here, voting rights, if you guys have some sort of board of directors, board of trustees, or who's in charge. Usually the CEO's in charge, the founder's in charge, until you start hiring a position out in order to grow. So keep that in mind. Equity investing, we've already talked about these, but ultimately what is considered fair market value? So that's one thing you guys have to develop. I recommend using fair market value in terms of, you could start looking at how much your time is worth. If you're an occupational therapist, Jessica, then how many hours, what's your hourly rate worth? So then you can start using that as a baseline for figuring out what your fair market value is. Same thing for you, Hyung. What is your fair market value in terms of your expertise in the industry you're going into? And so those are one ways to start quantifying how much you're worth and how much your hourly rate is worth. So now you can do hourly, daily, weekly, and then monthly. The yearly salaries are one way to compensate that. So as it says here, you don't have to have a working knowledge of them, but as long as you explain this with an addendum saying that in the future we'll be able to discuss this in detail, and really you'll be looking at the fair market value and how to do that. So another way of compensation is salary and compensation. So it's pretty self-explanatory. I won't go into detail here, but I will guide your attention to these links: the founder compensation and our guide to startup CEO salary. So I wanted to put that here because this article is important. I suggest you read it, but to go over the big stuff, it gives you some general stuff on how to determine fair market value, the bad things about having a bad founders agreement, the good things of it. But I really want to point out the list down here. Oh, it doesn't say it. So just give this article, but ensure that you're not paying too much or too little to founders, or not at all. And we'll talk about what compensation looks like. So here, this article here, it's called the Startup CEO Salary. How much should a company CEO make? So just to give you guys an example of like the dollar figure amount, what you should be expecting on the first, second, third years are as follows. So there's a section here about too much and a section on too little. But we want to go to the just right section. Here we go. So there is a sweet spot, but it really depends on founder philosophy. For example, our philosophy is the CEO is the highest paid employee and sets the ceiling, but we keep our ceilings very low. That's an example of where the CEO is the highest paid and everybody else can base their salary structure based on the CEO. To give an example of, I make about $40,000 per year as a CEO. This sets a standard for all the other employees. They now know that they won't make more until our company is successful. It also shows that all employees are in the trenches together. People who use this kind of salary compensation package are like Tesla, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and I'm not sure about Jeff Bezos, but I know Microsoft founder Bill Gates used this kind of compensation. So they had shares and they weren't paying themselves anything until their company grew. I believe that Elon Musk was working for $1 a year or compensation or per month per year, but he had a bunch of shares. So his company, his wage or his compensation only grew when Tesla grew. If it didn't, then he didn't make any money for that. So keep that in mind of some ways to compensate salary for CEOs and others. Some companies, on the other hand, don't set the CEO's salary as the top number. Instead, they keep their pay low and save that money to pay for important hires, like skilled developers, for example. So this is another way of approaching it. Ultimately, what's important here is that who's the most valuable? What do you want to prioritize? Speed to market, your personal compensation, or impact? And these are other ways to compensate for that. So the graph also provides founder salary overview. In general, for 11,000 startups that were surveyed, most of them had a salary that was around 50K per year. These graphs here break it down even further based on income. So if they're making 0 to 50K, so you can see that about 8,000 of these founders were only making anywhere from 0 to 50K. This graph here shows that it varies based on funding level. So if you're ranging from 0 to 500,000, most salaries, most CEOs pay themselves about $35,000. To the 1 million mark, they moved up by $3,000 at 38, and then commiserate to the growth of the company. So you can see that the starting salaries are very low, but it's because all profits and revenues are reinvested into the company and to the people. And you're going to have to do that for the first, probably 3 to 5 years until you guys have really growth. And this is a really good chart here. The average founder salary by product phase. So you can see it's broken down by major product phase, a concept, working prototype, all the way to mature product. And you can see for the first 3 phases, it's no more than $41,000, but an average of $40,000. And that's a yearly compensation. And it's only this low because it's only like this because they have to live. You have to have a living wage. And so this is what this compensates for, something called a living wage. So roughly around, globally, it's around $40,000. Then as you can see, as they start to get traction, which is a functional product that they can sell, they can pay themselves a little bit more. Then when you had a high growth or scaling potential and a growth strategy that took off, usually in years 2 or 3, then you can pay yourself more, and then more and more as the product matures. So please read these articles as well. Now I'm going to go to my talking points. I'll go ahead and stop the screen share. And here I listed down a couple of talking points that are relevant to this conversation. So the first thing is that, once again, we want to highlight the fair monetary value. So a quick note on this: ideas they don't have a monetary value. Only sales do. And the figure that was told to me by my mentor and by a couple accelerator programs at Johns Hopkins was that $100,000 in revenue equals some sort of market validation. So if you have anything less, then it's a product that hasn't been tested and validated by the market. So if it's an idea, ideas are essentially, they're worthless because they don't carry any plan, they don't have any products with them, and they can change, and they will change. Just like I told you guys, my grassroots Peacebuilders has gone through 12 iterations and is likely to go through another 3 or 4 before we find our proper product market fit. So keep that in mind. Another big critical concept is the value exchange. So value exchange happens in really 4 different ways. Number 1 is sweat equity. Sweat equity is how much work do you do? Working hours. So 20 hours minimum for part-time, 40 hours for full-time, 60 hours typically for a founder. And then the motivated founder is about 100 hours per week. So if you're doing anything less than 20 hours, then maybe you probably don't have enough sweat equity to compensate or to validate a equity position of worth. The specific knowledge is another key thing. So we already discussed this in detail, but this could be the like subject matter expertise or consultations that you normally pay. For example, a lawyer, usually around $300 to $100 to $300 per hour. So those are ways you could start getting compensation. So if the business planning and support I'm giving you guys, usually anywhere from $100 to $200 per hour. So these are ways to start quantifying. So yeah, maybe I'm not doing 20 hours per week or 40 hours per week, but my 1 to 3 hours is worth, 10 hours of my time is worth anywhere from $1,000 to $2,000. You know what I mean? Something like that. So that's how you start compensating. Both of you guys have specific skill sets and knowledge. So you guys have a similar compensation metric when you start quantifying your monetary value. Because I know both of you guys have very high hourly rates. So keep that in mind and start using that as a baseline of your work breakdown structure for how to quantify and qualify how many hours and how much your time is worth. Then capital. So capital is money. So are you putting in 100,000, 10,000? What does 10,000 equal in the grand scheme of things? If, for example, Hyung wins the $120,000 competition and $10,000, that's 1/12. 1/12 of the overall equity, and so her company is now rated at 120K. But is that accurate? What are the future revenue projections? How much can it grow? So we'll see how that looks like. And so right now it's still a little bit too early to tell. So, but you got to start compensating for that. In a founder's agreement, there is an addendum or a clause you could put up there saying, and it's on the screen, it's on the website, but it's something to the court of, we can reassess the fair market value when we discuss that in the future. So meaning that you'll get compensated fair market value. So if it's a $300,000 company, then 10% of that is 30K, something like that. And finally, resources. So resources include networks, they include new clients, maybe you're combining clientele, maybe you're combining product lines. So these already have to be existing, because if it's an idea without an existing product-based client personnel, network, nothing, then it's worthless. So just keep that in mind. And then another big one is necessary equipment or space. So maybe you need an office space, and now you have an office. For example, the Hong Kong University, the PolyU University's incubator space. That's a way that they're exchanging resources, sharing resources with you guys. But if you're sharing the same networks, then you can do that. So keep that in mind. Finally, here, what did I put here? Yeah, I just want to reiterate that a good metric to start looking at for market validation is $100,000 in revenue. And then you need to keep as much, both of you guys, and really anybody listening to this podcast needs to keep as much equity as possible to receive room for investors and additional people, for that full-time personnel that are going to make your product go from 0 to 100. And so keep that in mind. I hope this is helpful. Reach out with any questions, and I'll see you on the next one.